Noswaith, good evening. Thank you for joining the HEC Annual Conference 2020 via a digital medium, which hopefully no one's a stranger to at the moment. This is the first session kicking off 3 days of virtual events with an overview of the red meat market in 2020. I'd like to remind you that questions can be sent via the platform and they will be addressed in the Q&A section towards the end. So looking at tonight's session, we're looking at what has driven consumer demand and market prices in 2020. We've got specialists in retail and food service are joining our marketing and industry insight team to study how adaptation has been the key, and looking forward to 2021. So I'd like to introduce, we've got Glesney Phillips, who is a data analyst at HEC. We've got Justin Lines, who's a client manager at Kantar, and Philippa Gill, our brand marketing executive at HEC. So just some brief sort of biogs of our speakers this evening. So firstly, Glesney Phillips has been the data analysis for HEC for the last 2.5 years. She works closely with the red meat supply chain to collate and analyse intelligence to monitor market and inform the industry of current trends and figures. Glesney is a graduate of Cardiff University with a degree in zoology, who spent a year in the rainforests of Borneo carrying out research, but now lives on her family farm near Cardigan. Justin works for Kantar. It's one of the world's leading data and insights and consulting companies. They analyse who, why, where, how and when products are bought and used. Justin works in the meat, fish and poultry markets, spending much of the year monitoring how the market has reacted to coronavirus. He previously worked for a food manufacturer in the Welsh Valleys, born and raised in Abergavenny, but is now based in London. Pip Gill is a brand marketing executive for HEC and has worked with the company now for 8.5 years. She's responsible for development and management of the PGI Welsh Lamb and PGI Welsh Beef brands to consumers and manages all integrated consumer campaigns within the UK. Pip grew up in London and then came to university in Aberystwyth. And though left to travel for the world for a year and work in Cardiff for a while, she returned to call it her home. So I'd like to please pass it over to Glesney, who will kick off with the market.
Hello, thank you, Rachel. I'm just having some technical difficulties trying to share my screen. Hold on just a second. Right, it doesn't look. Anyway, I will talk you through what I was going to present on. So I was going to give a brief update firstly on the lamb market. Oh, it's working. Hold on 2 seconds. Let's have a look. Technical difficulties.
It'll be all right on the night. Don't worry.
You would like to think so. Why is this not working? No, I don't think this is going to work, is it? Right. Oh, it is working. It will be. Oh, right. Okay. Right. Sorry. I'll get on with it now. So I'll give you a brief update on firstly how the lamb market has been performing so far this year from my perspective, and then secondly have a look at the beef market. So we'll start off by taking a look at the lamb market. So prime lamb prices at auction markets in Wales have really held their ground since the sharp decrease that we saw during the initial lockdown period, and the average between July and September has been trending around pence above last year. Prices then fell below the £2 a kilo average during the last week of September, and they have continued to average just below the £2 a kilo mark up until last week, with the latest price to average £2.06 a kilo, which is around 30 pence above year-earlier levels and well above the 5-year average. And so despite the challenges faced by the market during the pandemic, lamb prices have been relatively strong during recent months, and so we'll have some of the factors behind this. So looking at the throughput levels at UK abattoirs, we can see that lamb throughput between September is down slightly on the year by 0.8%, and this is mainly due to decreased throughput during the March and April period. But then the more recent May to September period, throughput has picked up in recent months and is actually 3.5% above those months seen last year. And then looking at the throughput of cull ewes and rams, throughput between January and September is down significantly on the year by 13.5%, and it hasn't really picked up in recent months either. Part seeing such a large year-on-year decrease in cull sheep throughput. Maybe that cull numbers were quite high in 2019, and so we're just not seeing the same level of throughput coming in. So taking both the throughput of lambs and cull sheep ration, the total production of sheep meat so far this year is down 4.1% on year earlier levels, but production in recent months more similar to last year. And then if we move on to look at the trade of sheep meat in the UK up until August this year, volumes have really picked up during the last couple of months, whilst the input volumes have remained quite low. So for August, input volume is 3% lower than this time of year, which has brought the total to stand around 10% below 2019. Export volumes during August were some 5% down on the year, but to August 2018. And this has brought the total export volume so far to around 8% below earlier levels. During June and July of this year, there was some strong growth for exports due to strong retail demand from the EU and also due to the relative weakness of the pound versus the euro supporting trade. Therefore, demand on the continent for UK lamb will play an important part in the coming weeks and months as many countries enter a second lockdown. And so if we summarise the production and the trade figures for the January to August period, we can see that the actual volume of sheep meat available on the domestic consumption was down 5% on 2019. So this is due to both the throughput and the average carcass weights being down on the year, which led to a 5% drop. And then if we combine that with a 10% drop in imports, then the volume of lamb available on the market is less than that in 2019. Therefore, a decrease in the availability of lamb on the domestic market would have given some support to UK prices in the period. And in addition to the reduced volume of lamb available on the domestic market, you'll hear in the remainder of this session tonight that while supply was demand for lamb, especially at retail, has been quite strong in recent months, and therefore a combination of these factors would have had a positive impact on the prices that we've been seeing so far this year. And if we move on to the supply side of the beef market, and on the graph shows, the average deadweight prices for steers in England and in Wales have been quite mixed so far in. The prices at this year trended below historical levels and then experienced a significant drop during the initial lockdown period in demand and some initial carcass imbalance issues. Since the beginning of June, however, deadweight prices have been trending above year earlier, reached a peak of almost £3.70 a kilo for steers during the middle of August. Since this peak, prices have been relatively stable. This recent price for last week averaging £3.64 a kilo for steers, which is around 47 pence higher than year earlier levels. So cattle prices are good and have been strong in recent months, although they do follow a prolonged period of low prices. Overall, cattle is up by 1.2% when compared to the same period in 2019. But when we break this down between the cattle categories, we can see that the throughput of cattle is down significantly on the year by around 35%. And this is influencing the overall change that we're seeing in throughput. So the throughput of prime cattle is 3.2% on the year, and as a result accounted for over 70% of total throughput at UK abattoirs. And heifer is really driving this increase, with numbers up 6% a year. The strong cattle prices experienced over the summer may help producers to bring cattle forward, and this is also true for adult cattle, as their throughput so far this year is up almost 3% on 2019. We've seen the average carcass weights being slightly lighter during recent months, which does suggest that cattle may have been bought of the strong prices. Following the increased throughput of prime and adult cattle, the total production of beef in the UK so far on the same period last year. And then looking at the trade of beef in the UK between January and August, For August itself, input volumes were almost 2% higher than August 2019, but the total volume imported so far this year remains around 8% below year earlier level. The main beef exporter to the UK, but figures for the year to date show that imports from Ireland are down almost 5% on 2019. And this is likely due to COVID-related processing issues in Ireland, coupled with a decrease in demand for Irish beef when the UK food service sector was down. Export volumes for August were down on the year, which brings the total volume of beef exported so far to be around 8 below 2019. It's worth noting here as well that 2019 was a particularly strong year for beef exports because there was a large demand for red meat following the African swine fever outbreak in their pig herd. And therefore, this year's monthly export volumes are appearing significantly lower than year earlier levels. In fact, the volume exported so far this year is almost higher than 2018. To summarise the supply of the beef market, if we look at the production and trade figures for the January to August period, the figures suggest that the actual volume of beef available for production on the domestic market was up 2% on 2019. So this is due to a higher throughput of cattle, leading to a 3.5% increase in beef production, and coupled with a drop in the volume exported, then the volume of beef available on the market is up on the year despite input volumes being down. So although supply is slightly higher than year earlier levels, the shift from food service to retail during the COVID-19 pandemic has demand for UK grown beef and reduced the need for imported beef. Therefore, prices have been relatively strong due to demand for beef despite a slight increase in supply. And both the lamb and the beef markets do face challenges during the coming months, so HCC will be keeping a close eye on how the markets react. Diolch.
Lovely. Diolch, Glezni. So we'll pass on now to Justin, who will give us some insight of the 2020 trends and the sort of market. So hopefully he will seamlessly be able to share his screen. No pressure. There we go. Thank you, Justin.
Diolch. Can you hear me? Right, am I heard?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. So I'm Justin, I'm from Kantar, and what I'll show you now is what it's like in the supermarkets this year, what it's been, how we responded to COVID.
Sorry, Justin, actually you're a little bit quiet. I don't know whether you can move a bit closer to your microphone. Would that be possible, please?
How about now? Better or worse? How about now?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okie dokie. Brilliant. So there's going to be two parts to this. The first I'll deliver now. I think Pip's then going to take you through her section, and then I will come on to the future in the end. So part one is, what I'm going to show you is that lockdown has reversed red meat decline. We saw red meat in decline before lockdown happened, and then since lockdown happened, we've seen large levels of growth. Now, this is driven by the fact that people are at home more often than they usually are, and they're eating a lot more at home as well. And this is on top of the fact that we've had great weather this year, and lockdowns led to a bit of bad discipline from some shoppers. And then later on in the future, part two, I will talk about how some of these we expect to change, some of these behaviours we expect to change and stick, but that we can't rely on lockdown, and that there are bigger problems to address in the declining markets prior to lockdown. So what I'm showing you here is MFP volume since 2016. And as you can see, we reached a peak at the end of 2018 where we had 3.23 billion kilograms of MFP being sold, meat, fish and poultry. And then since the end of 2018, we've had this continual decline. So right before lockdown started, where this ends, we saw over a year's worth of decline. So it was not a good position. And it was even worse for red meat. So MFP had declined at 1.2%, red meat was declining at 2.6%. So it's really tough for the red meat market. But then lockdown came along, and all of those red bars that you see, which show decline in the market, that shoppers buying less red meat, that changed. Lockdown hit, and suddenly we saw a huge spark of growth. And that growth is driven by what this chart here will show you. So if it's at the bottom of the chart, that means it's in decline. If it's in the top of the chart, that's in growth. And so the big thing we saw, the big change, is that people went to the supermarkets less often. So they were only doing 1 or 2 big trips a week. But when they did go to the supermarket, they were buying really, really big baskets. And so in a way, during lockdown, shoppers went back to how they used to shop, with the sort of the weekly shop, big baskets, stock up, and then wait till the next week to do the same again. Whereas in recent years, we had seen that people were doing a lot more shops, but smaller baskets, topping up with their fresh products. So the big change here was suddenly people were doing fewer but much bigger shops. The reason behind these big shops is because we had more people at home. So more people moved home because of the lockdown. And so usually people would have their lunch at work, at school, sort of in the office. And now suddenly we had 5 new occasions in home at the weekday. So 30% increase in the amount of food people were eating at home. So that's the big driver. More people at home, eating more food at home. So that's going to benefit the supermarket. And that really did benefit pretty much all of the supermarkets. Ocado grew the fastest because they were the best prepared. They also grow from the smallest base. So being an online retailer, they fitted the restrictions perfectly. But even Asda, who grew at the slowest rate of all the supermarkets, they still grew at 10%. Now that's huge figures, because usually we'd see growth in 1 or 2%. To be in double-digit figures is really quite impressive. So all the supermarkets did well throughout lockdown. But there were 2 sort of different stories. You had pork and beef, where they had a great start during that surge. If you remember the time when everyone was stealing loo rolls, that they were also buying a lot of beef and pork at that time. Whereas for lamb, they really suffered because lockdown hit at the same time as Easter. So suddenly people couldn't go and celebrate with their families. The occasions in which people were having the Easter roast were much smaller. So it took the rest of the year for lamb to catch up. So you have beef and pork doing really well at the start and continuing throughout. And you had lamb having a rough start, but making up for it towards the end of the year. So on top of the fact that you have a lot of people at home buying a lot more food because they're eating a lot more food at home, we also had good weather. So the summer came much earlier this year. What this chart shows you here, the blue line is this year's sunshine compared to previous years. And if you see, it peaks further to the left than previous years. What that's showing you is that we had a hotter summer earlier this year. What that means for the red meat category is that people have more barbecues, and when people have more barbecues, they buy more burgers and sausages. So this red line here shows you that the barbecues that people had started much earlier, and they had a lot more of them. So as people are stuck inside, they're treating themselves to barbecues, trying to make the most of the situation. And treating is a continual trend that we saw this year. So right at the start of lockdown, we asked the public, do you think that you're going to make the most of this lockdown? Are you going to go out and do your 5K runs? Are you going to be eating apples all the time? And a third said they were. They said, yeah, I'm going to make the most of lockdown. But another third said, you know what, we're probably going to stay at home and binge. And it turned out that that third was correct for pretty much the whole country. When lockdown hit, health went out of the window. People stocked up on calories. What you can see here is that calories grew faster than the rest of food and drinks. So people were piling in the crisps and the cakes and the alcohol. So when lockdown hit, health went out of the window. And when health goes out of the window, red meat does really well. Because we know that people switch away from red meat for health reasons. They're buying into meat-free because they perceive it as a healthier choice. Red meat does well when taste is the priority. And during lockdown, taste was the priority. So that's what's happened in the market this year. Lockdown reversed the red meat decline has been really useful for the red meat market. And this is because there are more people at home eating at home, so they buy more at the supermarkets. And on top of this, we had great weather and people were choosing taste over health. I'll take you through what we can do in the future after Pip's given her section. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Justin. So we'll be moving on to Pip next, who will sort of give us a direction in terms of Welsh lamb and Welsh beef in 2020. So thanks, Pip.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Present. Okay.
There we go. Thanks, Pip.
Okay. So thank you to Justin and Glasney for setting the scene for us. So obviously we were looking at demand changes within the retail and food service sector, and right at the start and before the big lockdown in March, we saw a big surge in cheaper cuts like mince, and then obviously the closure of the multi-billion-pound food service industry for us. Whilst there had been these surges in retail demand and some meat products like mince and butchers were also reporting unprecedented demand, we'd also seen this closure in the food service sector and the instability, and therefore we needed to look at how we could target people and our consumers to look at basically choosing the more expensive cuts, so look at the steaks that weren't being sold in food service anymore. So this was a major issue for us because of the carcass balance. Also, with people's shopping habits changing and people's media viewing habits changing, we were looking to see how we could basically improve the way we were showing our advertising to people and get this across. From Kantar figures, it was shown that during the lockdown, 48% of consumers were using social media more than they had previously, and 46% of spending was done on the internet, with 38% of an increase of consumption of videos being viewed online. So people were looking at different ways to get inspiration for cooking. So just quickly, the key objectives for us were encouraging our housebound families and individuals to increase their purchase of non-minced products, so Welsh lamb and Welsh beef, in both supermarkets and retail. We also looked to increase our social media following during this time because that's where people were looking for inspiration, and then to increase our e-bulletin sign-up to be able to get those captured audiences the information they were looking for. So as we're aware, it was a difficult time, and it wasn't a time where we could go out and shoot new advertising because no one was allowed out. So with these restrictions around the country, we looked to use the ambassadors that we already had on board with us. So Chris Roberts, who many of you may be aware of and have seen at the Royal Welsh Show, who we've worked with over the past couple of years, came on board, and we looked at using a pimped up steak sandwich challenge. So hashtag Meet the Challenge was used throughout all our social media channels, and was a huge success. We were just shy of 500,000 views of the video, and we also had some great celebrity endorsement of this campaign. And with the entries that were coming in for the competition, they were really of high caliber, which was great to see. We also utilised the Culinary dozen, so chefs that we've worked with previously whose businesses have been closed down. So we spoke to them and asked would they be able to create recipes that we could then share with our consumers at home that would make restaurant meals accessible to people for themselves to cook at home. And we had some great video views and reach of this. So we reached over 1 million people through the different videos that we created. And these were from a steak au poivre through to sort of your steak and chips to have at home, but with that restaurant feeling. So we had some great video views and also some engagement from that. Also, we utilised the elements that we had already within HCC, so steak videos that we had, and Elwyn Roberts, our consumer executive, was able to produce videos at home to make sort of cooking easier for those and more accessible for everybody to see. We also utilised our educational resources, with children being at home as well and off school. We gave elements to parents to be able to download booklets and leaflets for their children to use at home to learn about local farming and local sources. And also there were quick and easy recipes for those children to do. We had media partnership work, so we worked alongside Immediate, who have the BBC Country Farm magazine, Delicious magazine, and BBC Good Food. We ran competitions with them, and we utilised their social channels as well to access a greater number of consumers. And through this, we were able to manage to get almost 8,000 new follow-ups to our newsletter, and we had 11,486 members entries to the competition that we were running. So we were really able to engage with the audience who were looking for the content and looking for elements of Welsh lamb and Welsh beef. We used radio advertising as well, due to people being at home and using these medias. We had a 6-week radio campaign that was running in North Wales, South Wales, through all the regions, and we had a reach of over 1 million. And then we had the press advertising and digital that was also running with the Wales Online and Daily Post. So we had adverts going into their newspapers as well as digitally viewed. And then our newsletter, which we targeted ourselves to increase the sign-ups at the start of the campaign, because we knew we could utilise this channel to then feed to those people who really wanted to learn about the product. And we were able to take our subscribers from 11,000 followers up to 23,000 followers. And we had an open rate of 35.3%, which is well above average for this kind of newsletter. The average at the moment is 23.1. Then obviously utilised the content that we had to look at press and media coverage through TV, and as I said, radio, and we were able to get a couple of our elements onto the Daily Kitchen Live with the girls from Hangfire, who were able to cook a Welsh lamb dish. We also had some good timing through some of the Culinary Dozen, where Hugh Griffiths at the time had been on Great British Menu, so that really increased the visibility for us. So what did that activity do for us? So obviously at that time, when our activity was out, we saw the spend of beef go up by 23.4% during that period. The volume of beef was up 23.1%. The number of buyers was up by 17%, and the total number of buyers was up by 5.3%. So there were new buyers coming onto the market, which was really good for us to see. Also, we can see here that during this time, there was a sharp rise in steak sales, which was what we were really pushing through the steak competition and with the Culinary Dozen. So this was a really positive outcome for us for the messaging. Then we moved on to our lamb work. That basically started with Lamb Day, so the celebration of the sort of the peak season of lamb into the market, and we utilised the content that we were able to create using new recipe images that we had, and sourcing that out. And we learnt from some of the elements that we were doing that posting really good images, really good recipes became, and not quite as often, became a much better way of reaching the audiences that we were after. We also utilised Hugh Griffiths again here to run a barbecue competition that saw our Instagram following grow by 96% just in August alone. And we had over 4,619 people enter the competition, and a lot more new members again to our Welsh Lamb newsletter. Love Lamb Week also saw fantastic results this year for us. In terms of year-on-year increases, we saw over 1,000% increase in our engagement, which was fantastic with the content that we have. And we also utilised again a couple of our ambassadors to create for the new young foodies coming up some really interesting recipes that was all about flame cooking, outside cooking, and using some really different cuts like lamb hearts, and just very alternative to what has been out there before, but has some great followings through. And as you can see from the results here, almost 1 a million reach or over a million reach for the videos that were out there. We've also then done some work with the retailers. So these retailers, we've been working with the Waitrose around a competition that we had a partnership with to win a £250 voucher. So we've worked with them. Again, this was a utilisation for us to be able to get new members of our target audiences to sign up to our Welsh Lamb newsletter. So we've been working with Waitrose on this. And we had advertising with Sainsbury's that's into their in-store magazines. And also we have a piece of work that will be going out with Asda moving forward for a Christmas campaign where they'll be doing specific Welsh lamb leg and half lamb food order for their Christmas range, and we'll have digital 6 sheets up. So what has this activity done for us so far? With lamb sales, we can see sales were up by 15.5% at £133 million, and the total of lamb purchases were up 11% year on year. And the price of lamb is up 4.1% during this period, and our penetration is 7.7%, which has been really good, and seeing a lot more consumers engaging with lamb. So what have our campaign highlights been? So for April to May, we saw a 400% growth in the website visits year on year, with a range of new chefs, content secured over that period and resulting in hundreds of thousands of video views with those chefs. Our beef social channels have grown at a very strong rate of 1.5 thousand new followers, which represents a 12% growth over that rate. We've got strong performance through our immediate partnerships with 7,000 new followers onto our Welsh Lamb family newsletter. We had some digital activity around Love Lamb Week, which has seen huge growth and shows how much people are using the digital channels to get their information about recipes and just information in general about the products. And then obviously we've had our BBQ competition, and then further partnerships with Reach for media. And then our social audiences continue to grow. And by looking and testing out posting less often against posting daily, we've seen that using high quality images has paid dividends for us. And with the beef and the lamb campaigns running this year, we've now seen 168% increase in our followers to our lamb newsletters. That's everything from me.
Thanks, Pip. There's some really positive messages there from our sort of campaign work this year. Before we pass on to Justin for the sort of final presentation where he'll look at sort of future projections, just like to remind everyone that they can submit questions via the chat facility on the right-hand side of their screen for the Q&A section after Justin. Thanks, Justin.
Okay, give me a kick if my audio is not working. So just to remind you of what I said previously, we saw that lockdown had been in decline. Red meat had been in decline prior to lockdown, but then lockdown had reversed that because there were more people at home buying more from the supermarkets with great weather and people going for taste over health. Now, when we're thinking about the future, obviously there's a huge amount of unknowns because we don't know what restrictions will look like after lockdown. We don't know how long it will go on for, when there's going to be a vaccine. But what we can be pretty confident with is that there will be at least some behaviours picked up during this year that will stay on afterwards. There's a great study in 2014 where they looked into events that happened in London. So on a particular day, there was a tube strike and 2 or 3 of the lines were shut for the day. People had to find different ways to get to work. They had to change their commute. Now, this only happened in 24 hours, but what the study found is that within those 24 hours and afterwards, 1 in 20 people had changed their commute permanently. So if people can change their commute in 24 hours, people can definitely change their shopper behaviour after a year of restrictions. But of the things that are going to stay and change, we're not entirely sure. We think there's going to be that purchase of mince is probably going to stay the same because there's going to be less money in the bank and people will be going for cheaper cuts that they can do more with. But what I really
Sorry to interrupt, Justin. It's still, the sound is quite in and out. It's sort of the volume's going up and down. I'm not sure.
Okay, let me give something else.
I can see you're saying some really interesting stuff, and I don't want anyone to be missing any of it.
Okay, maybe if I just talk very slowly. That's the plan. Okay, so what I really want to use this time with this audience to say is that, yes, there will be things from lockdown that will stick, but there is a bigger issue, which is the performance of the market prior to lockdown. We were in that decline for a number of years, for more than a year at least, and that was because people were buying less. So people were buying less red meat. Now, I did some research this year, and what we found is that all of that decline, that those red lines were being driven not by vegans or vegetarians or pescatarians or flexitarians, but by normal shoppers who don't have a specific diet, just naturally buying less. Some of these shoppers were even telling us that they were going to buy more red meat in the new year, and yet we were seeing from their purchase behavior that they're buying less. So all of this decline we're seeing in the red meat isn't coming from vegans and vegetarians like the news says. It is coming from people just naturally not buying red meat because it isn't as convenient or it isn't as tasty as some of the things they're looking out for. So there are unconscious reasons why people are buying less, not conscious reasons such as vegans or vegetarians. Now, the great thing that lockdown showed us was that these people in purple, this 35% of people who are causing all the decline without realizing it, what lockdown showed us was that they were very happy to buy meat again. So because they're declining unconsciously, it's quite easy to nudge them back into growth. When lockdown kicked in, all of these people suddenly started buying lots of red meat again. So it isn't that they don't like red meat, there's just other reasons for it. Now, what I would love for the industry to think about over the next year or so is how can we get those people who are reducing unconsciously to continue to buy into the category once these restrictions are over. Lockdown, if you think about it, is a very, very big nudge. It's more of a shove. It's saying you're stuck at home, you're going to have to buy more products. What I want us to think about is how can we get those unconscious people to be nudged into it in years to come. So I'm sure you've probably all heard this story before. You've heard about nudge theory before, but for anyone who hasn't, I'll just remind you, there was an airport in Amsterdam and they were spending a lot of money on cleaners having to go into the male bathrooms and maybe, let's say, clean up for those who missed the target. And this was costing them a lot of money and it was really unpleasant for everyone else in the bathroom. So they wanted to change this. Now, they could have put big signs up saying aim properly or something like that, but they didn't. What they did, if you look very closely at the urinal on the right, if I zoom in, they painted a little fly in the urinal, on all the urinals. And this suddenly had a massive increase in the amount of chances that men hit the target. Suddenly, the cleaning fee was a lot less. And this is just a little idea of the sort of nudge you can do to get people to behave in the way that you want them to. Now, for red meat, the big nudge that we've got to do is about convenience. People have got to feel that the product is easy to buy, to cook, to eat, and most importantly, to throw away. Kantar did a survey where we asked people, do you think you need convenience? And 7.3 million people said, yeah, you know what, we rely heavily on convenience. Now, that is complete rubbish, by the way. The entire country relies on convenience. The whole process of shopping is a convenient process. If you didn't want convenience, you'd have to rear your own pig and butcher your own pig every time you wanted dinner. So everyone relies on convenience, but 7.3 million people really recognize that. Now, the good thing for the red meat market is there is some good hope in the world of convenience. So I looked at all the spend that had increased over the last 5 years. So where there was growth, I collected it all together. And 30% of that came from a group of products that we call added value. So these are your marinades, your sous vide, such as pulled pork and things like that. as well as ready to cook, where you have the meat in a tray, often treated beforehand so it can be put straight into the oven. So those three small product categories made up 30% of all the growth that we've seen in the last 5 years, which is incredible because they only make up 5% of spend. So this tiny little part of the market is where all the growth is coming from. Now that is really unusual. You don't see that often, to see such a big difference between share of spend and percentage of growth. Now, ready to cook does really well in poultry. Poultry has a huge share of the market, but red meat doesn't. Pork, lamb, and beef don't have enough products in trays which are oven ready for people to put straight in the oven. Because the best thing about this product, the reason it nudges people into buying more red meat, is because not only is it easy to buy and cook and eat, but perhaps most importantly, what we're seeing them say that it is easy to throw away afterwards. They don't have to clean the baking tray. Now that may sound insignificant, but nudges really do show that little changes create big differences at a big scale. So some behaviors will stick. We will see people buying mince in the new year to manage spend and to manage restrictions because it's a more useful cut to have. But we can't rely on lockdown. We're going to have to think about those people that are actually causing the decline in the red meat, the people who are unconsciously reducing. They're not vegans, they're not vegetarians, they're just naturally moving away from meat because it is less easy for them to cook and throw away than other products. And so if we make the products easier with things like getting more red meat into trays, you're going to see a return to growth in the market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin. Who'd have thought we'd been talking about urinals on a Tuesday evening, but it was a good example. Now, moving very swiftly on, we've got time for a few questions, and we've been joined by John Richards, who's the Industry Development and Relations Manager for HCC, and he'll be able to field any questions that would have been destined for Glesney's presentation. So looking at the chat, the first question is, and this is one for you, John, is in relation to calf slaughter numbers. In Glesney's slides, are these cattle under 10 months old, and could they be broken down further by age at slaughter?
Yes, good evening everybody first of all, but yeah, it could be split down further by looking at BCMS data. The data shown on that slide was from DEFRA and DEFRA slaughtering, so it's not strictly comparable, but it is something we're doing. Shortly, within the next month, we'll be launching a booklet, which is about dairy beef and what can be done with that sector. Some of that information will be shown in that booklet. So I think hopefully that answers your question, David.
Fantastic, thank you. And this is probably one for you, Pip. It's from Bryn Hughes. And what's your strategy to discredit vegan propaganda?
The vegan question. So I guess what we've been doing that came out at the start of this year was we had a huge sustainability campaign that we ran to basically prove that we're not mass farming. It's a very traditional method of farming that we've always used. And we will be running a similar sort of campaign moving into next year when Veganuary happens again then. And the difficulty sort of discretioning and going at the vegans is they're always going to come back at you. They're very opinionated. But I think we have to look at the people. We're always, when we're doing any of our marketing and things, we always target the people who are looking for our products, basically. And we do research into those audiences to make sure that we, in some ways, we don't target, basically, we don't look at targeting people, the vegan element of people. But we also then make sure that with our marketing, we're showing how sustainable our products are.
Lovely, thanks, Pip. I've got one for you here, Justin, from Mike Gooding. How many of those people who reduce red meat purchases were or are facing redundancy? He has also got another sort of a comment, more of a comment or statements after, that he suspects that ramifications of COVID are much greater. So obviously we've got the long-term impact, but also in relation to lamb, he sees that one of the biggest single challenges would be exclusion from the EU as an export market. So I suppose, have you got any sort of comments or thoughts around those issues he's raised there, please?
Yeah, that's really interesting. The first thing to note is that the decline, when we class them as unconscious reducers, that was prior to lockdown. So these are people who have been cutting before lockdown started. And when lockdown begun, we saw those same people actually starting to buy more red meat again. But on the figures of redundancies and things like that, we haven't seen too much of people rationing their meat. Whereas with dairy, for example, we found that there were two segments, lower affluence, and we saw that they were actually using a lot less milk each time they used it, so a lot less in their cups of tea, a lot less in their cereal. So we haven't yet seen that much rationing. We've seen people move to cheaper cuts like mince, but we haven't seen rationing that we have seen in dairy, for example.
Thank you. I think we've probably got time just for two more questions. Got one here from Wyn Evans, Pip. It's probably one for you again. I'm going to perhaps twist the question a little bit because I think you've addressed a little bit of this before. But Wyn is talking about McDonald's sort of pushed on their plant-based burger, which I believe they've announced recently. So he's actually wondering how you then sort of perhaps balance promotion of a beef burger whilst keeping McDonald's on board.
In terms of McDonald's doing their beef as well as their
so I suppose so I imagine that perhaps Wyn's coming from the point of view that McDonald's are a pretty keen supporter of British farming and British primary agriculture, and it's how I suppose you balance those two agendas in terms of them still being a major source of sort of British beef, but also balancing that sort of plant-based agenda.
I guess for us, with any of our advertising and things like that, what we do in promotion of our beef, we bring in the burgers and we promote sort of different elements of the products and how it can be used. So we obviously have recipes and things that are there for people to use. And I guess they're there selling their vegan as well as their beef. And McDonald's are supporting both areas because they can see what the consumers are after. But our area of expertise and advertising and promoting and getting people to purchase is obviously through the beef element.
Fantastic. Thanks, Pip. I've just got one more question, and this is one that's come through social media. It's one for you, John. What is the outlook for next year in terms of supply of animals onto the market?
Well, if you look at what the kind of the UK June survey has shown us, is that they actually are the production levels or the breeding ewe and breeding cow levels are very similar this year to last. So between now and obviously that time when those lambs and calves are on the ground, there's a lot of time to go and different things can happen. But at this point in time, it'd be very similar supply level as we'd imagine. But obviously the winter and then the spring has to come and we'll see what the kind of conditions are during that time. But at this point in time, it looks very similar as far as our breeding ewe and cattle level.
Lovely. Diolch, John. Well, we've actually run over by 5 minutes, so I appreciate everyone's patience, and I'd like to thank all our panelists for grappling with technology. I think we've done a really good job of something that's very new to everyone, and I think we've agreed it's worked very well. I'd like to also encourage anyone who's viewing this at the moment to pop along to our next session, which starts at 7 o'clock, where we're looking actually about the high street heroes and the resurgence of independent butchers. So I believe if you click on the sessions link on the left-hand side of your screen, that should take you to sort of future sessions. And hopefully you'll all be joining us over the next couple of nights. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Yeah.